To set the stage for this discussion, I first want to acknowledge just how far back recovery goes historically in what we know as the United States. Organized recovery, as I've researched it, dates in the United States to the 1730s, and a series of Delaware prophets who, behind their own recovery from alcoholism, organized abstinence-based cultural and religious revitalization movements, the largest of which will later be the Handsome Lake movement that will evolve into the Longhouse religion, which continues to exist today. The central tenet of the Handsome Lake movement was a rejection of alcohol and a rejection of all other European folkways, and a return to native traditions and native folkways. We see behind the Handsome Lake movement a long series of prophet movements. The Shawnee prophet and the Kickapoo prophet that's going to then in the late 1800s emerge in the form of the Indian Shaker Church and the Native American Church. And we could actually continue this history forward within Native communities through the 20th century with the rise of culturally indigenous sobriety movements, including the beginning Indianization of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1950s, the emergence of the concept of the Red Road in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and the emergence of the contemporary Wellbriety movement that has rapidly spread through Native communities in the United States. If we look at Euro-American communities, organized recovery really dates to the 1830s. As people today we would know as alcohol dependent began to seek out early temperance societies and use those societies as a framework. I've actually got the first collection of recovery case studies in the United States in a pamphlet from 1833 by Sigourney and Smith that virtually catalogs these sort of reform case studies in the pre-Washingtonian years in the United States. In April of 1840, 6 men that were part of a drinkers club in Baltimore, Maryland, were sitting around one evening, as they did every evening, drinking and debating. And the debate this evening was on the proposition that all temperance lectures were hypocrites. And they decided that since there was a lecture on temperance that very evening, they would send out a subcommittee to research this. Can you imagine this happening? I think we probably could. The subcommittee goes, here's the lecture, comes back, a lively discussion ensues, and the upshot of that is a decision that they should start their own temperance society, but only for hard cases. Now, the term alcoholism hasn't yet been coined, but hard cases was the contemporary term for what we would later call alcoholism. That movement grew from these 6 men to more than 400,000 people within 48 months, and then almost disintegrated overnight. And the alcoholics in that movement went underground and began to organize recovery-focused fraternal temperance societies, closed societies organized by and for recovering alcoholics that function very well as sobriety-based frameworks for recovery, became very closed groups and quite elitist in their orientations. I actually have documents describing some of these groups who only wanted drunkards of good repute to be part of their societies. There may actually be a few of those groups still around. I will leave you to make that call. By the time we get to the 1870s, we have a new recovery framework emerges, which is the Ribbon Reform Clubs that's going to begin in the Northeast and rapidly spread south and begin to spread then into the Midwest. We're going to get other groups like the Dashaways in San Francisco. One of my favorite groups is the Drunkards Club in New York City. The point that I want to make here is we have a very large number of pre-AA alcoholic mutual aid societies. We also had societies emerge within the context of a growing network of addiction treatment programs in the 19th century. The first of these is the Alapod Club, organized within the New York State Inebriate Asylum. And we would have the Godwin Association and others. The largest of these is the Keeley Leagues, which were organized in the early 1890s and went on to have more than 30,000 members associated with the growing network of Keeley Institutes across the United States. This is an image of Keeley League number 1 in Dwight, Illinois, sitting over the banner, which was part of the advocacy message that came out. We're going to talk later about a new recovery advocacy movement. We had advocacy as a major theme among the Keeley Leagues. In 1895, they're going to march on the capital of the state of Pennsylvania, lobbying for a Keeley law that would provide state funds to pay for indigents to receive the Keeley cure who could not personally afford it. We also, as we began to see the growth of treatment in the United States, we actually have a very elaborate network of treatment in the 19th century. We have the early inebriate homes that's going to begin in this city in 1857 with the opening of a home for the fallen. I always think of I've fallen and I can't get up every time I say that. That home is going to open and close fairly quickly, but reopen under the banner of the Boston Washingtonian Home. And the Washingtonian Home in Boston and Chicago will be two of the premier inebriate homes in the United States, with both of those continuing well into the modern era. We're also going to have much more medically directed inebriate asylums. And this is going to begin with the opening of the New York State Inebriate Asylum in 1864. They're going to be, again, much more medically oriented than recovery focused. They're going to involve very physical methods of treatment, prolonged treatment, often legally mandated commitments for treatment, anywhere from 1 to 2 years. We're also going to have private for-profit addiction cure institutes that each are going to compete with one another for who can cure addiction the fastest with the least amount of hypodermic injections and vomiting. I will describe later a few of these. We're also going to have boxed and bottled home cures, the same proprietary drug industry that's going to addict large numbers of American citizens with opium and morphine and cocaine and alcohol-laced patent medicines, is then going to begin to offer cures for the alcohol, tobacco, and drug habits, nearly all of which will be loaded with alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, chloral hydrate, etc. We're going to see urban missions and rural inebriate colonies, which is in many ways the beginning of specialty sector faith-based recovery in the United States. And this is really going to begin with Jerry McCauley's work and the urban mission movement in New York City and the arrival of the Salvation Army and their special ministry to late-stage urban alcoholics in the 1880s. We're going to see during this time also specialized treatment for women. We tend to think of that as a relatively modern development, but we had specialized institutions exclusively for the treatment of addicted women. The shame related to this was so great, however, that many of the women entering treatment did so under assumed names, and even their physicians did not know their true identities. We're going to have a growing professionalization of this network of treatment, with the founding in 1870 of the American Association for the Study and Cure of Inebriety, the first scientific journal in addiction. The Journal of Inebriety is going to begin publication in 1875. And this entire movement is going to reach its heydays in the 1880s and 1890s. This is the image, this is the building, the New York State Inebriate Asylum. It's rather stunning to me when I think of the broken down Victorian homes that my first treatment programs existed in, to look back in 1864 and realize that facilities like this once existed. This is a typical cure for the private addiction cure institutes. You'll see the liquor habit is cured in 3 days, but it takes 10 to 14 days to cure morphine addicts. These are typical, some of the typical kind of miracle cures for alcoholism and drug dependence. This is one of my favorites. It's called 32 glass vials. You take a vial a day for 32 days. You're promised complete comfort in your detoxification and that the craving for alcohol will be forever destroyed. My only question to you was, would you trust a cure coming from a place called Pandora Laboratories? It was very common in these days to see very aggressive advertising by the pharmaceutical industry. Morphine, painless home cure, painless and permanent, providing some new miracle ingredient. Nearly all of these contain morphine, and most of them contain morphine at higher numbers of grains than most people were addicted. So in the name of treating addiction, people actually developed even more intractable addictions. And my point with this is the theme of harm in the name of help has a very, very long tradition in the history of addiction treatment. This widely spreading movement virtually collapsed in the late days of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And there were many things that contributed to this collapse. Ideological splits in the field. Sound familiar? A lack of science-grounded treatments. At the time, a spotlight was shown on this field, and there was a demand for scientific evidence behind claims of things like 100% cures. There simply was no scientific evidence to provide. The field had leaders who in the 1860s and 70s birthed this field and nurtured it into maturation as they matured in their careers. Only to then have, as the field faced incredible crises, the aging leaders had disengaged or lost energy and had not dealt with the issue of leadership succession and leadership development within the field. So in some ways, you could say this field died of old age, a phenomenon that actually could be replicated in the next decade if we're not extremely careful. There were also economic depressions that blindsided this field and forced policymakers and philanthropists to make very tough decisions around the allocation of these resources. Does any of this sound familiar to anyone? But more than anything else, that collapse of early treatment came from this culture literally losing faith in the prospects of long-term recovery. Behind 100 claims of these 95 and 100% cures, how long do you think it took before everyone in the culture knew someone for whom treatment had not worked? And with that growing pessimism came a radically different decision in this culture. What we said as a culture was, let's let the existing alcoholics and addicts die off, and the sooner the better. And we're going to prevent the creation of a new generation by legally prohibiting the sale of alcohol and aggressively and legally controlling the distribution of opium, morphine, cocaine, chloral hydrate, and the newly arriving barbiturates. With that collapse, we entered a very shameful period of regression within the field. Alcoholics and addicts were transferred to rural penal colonies and work farms that became attachments to county jails. They were transferred to the back wards of what were already aging state psychiatric asylums. And a very important note with that was the concept that addiction was a disorder in and of itself was destroyed, and with that came this belief that if addiction was simply a symptom of underlying psychopathology, then what that meant was that the treatment of addiction in insane asylums in this country would simply apply indiscriminately whatever was in vogue in psychiatry over the coming decades. And that would include periods of mandatory sterilization of alcoholics and addicts, particularly female addicts and alcoholics. It would include indiscriminate application of electro and chemoconvulsive therapies. It would include psychosurgery, particularly prefrontal lobotomies, as a treatment for addiction. It would include drug insults of every variety and extremely prolonged periods of sequestration. We also saw in the cities the emergence of foul wards and foul cells in the urban hospitals to deal with the issue of the chronic public inebriate, including the Boston City Hospital. We also began to see, again, these invasive treatments move from the specialty sector of psychiatry into the larger medical communities. These are images. I want to give you a little bit of a feel for what it was like for me to enter the field in 1969 and see the very tail end of what the world looked like before there was specialized addiction treatment in the United States. This is the alcoholism ward at Peoria State Hospital, where I was a volunteer in 1987 and 1988. What I can't convey to you is the despair, and what I can't convey to you is the smell of this place. Between the urine and feces and formaldehyde, you could smell this place within about 150 yards of approaching the building. These are the shackles that were moved by a very progressive psychiatrist, George Zeller, from the detoxification cells within Peoria State Hospital. This is an addict at Lexington in the 1930s receiving electroconvulsive therapy as an experiment to see if ECT would speed up the withdrawal process. This takes us to the rebirth, the beginnings that are going to rekindle the years that are going to lead to the rise of modern addiction treatment and recovery support as we know it. This is going to begin with the emergence of what many of us as historians have christened the modern alcoholism movement, including the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. It's going to include the development of the Yale School of Alcohol Studies. The Research Council on Problems of Alcohol are going to come together and basically promote a new scientific understanding of alcoholism. And the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is going to begin to rebirth public perception of hope for long-term recovery from alcoholism. For that movement to eventually rebirth a treatment system required replicable treatment models. And those models are going to come in the 1940s through the outpatient Yale clinics that are going to incorporate the use of lay therapists. These are recovering alcoholics, trained to be therapists and supervised by other therapists who will work within these outpatient clinics. We're going to see the extension of AA into AA wards in local hospitals in communities like Akron and New York and Philadelphia, and an AA ward in the Washingtonian Hospital here in Boston. We're going to begin to see the rise of a Minnesota model at Hazleton and Pioneer House and Wilmer State Hospital in the state of Minnesota in the late 1940s and the 1950s. And we're going to see that model taken to Chicago in an institution called Lutheran General Hospital that's going to set the stage for the mass replication of 28-day rehab programs throughout the United States in the 1980s. We also, on the drug addiction side, particularly narcotic addiction side, we're going to see three things. One is the emergence of therapeutic communities, beginning with Synanon in 1958, and the rapid growth of second-generation therapeutic communities. Synanon is itself going to go on and become an extremely closed, incestuous system and eventually implode, but will be enormously important in the sense that Synanon graduates are going to come to New York and start Daytop Village. And Daytop is going to go to Chicago and start Gateway and Phoenix and Reality and on and on and on. And that's going to exert an enormous influence on residential treatment during this time period. We're also going to get two pioneering physicians, Dr. Marie Neiswander, a psychiatrist, Dr. Vincent Dole, an endocrinologist, who are going to develop a metabolic theory of narcotic addiction and begin to pioneer the use of methadone as a maintenance agent in the treatment of chronic opioid addiction. We're also in the 60s going to see rising polydrug abuse, and we're going to see behind that the emergence of everything from things we then called acid rescue and community crisis clinics and street outreach programs, but most importantly, a modality called outpatient drug-free treatment that's going to pull in every imaginable psychological theory of addiction and spin that off into therapeutic interventions, mostly with young polydrug-using individuals and their families. The advocacy movement that's going to begin in the 1940s, and I really want to emphasize, we would not exist as a field today if there weren't, for the most part, recovering people and their families who spent the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, most of their adult lives, lobbying to radically change how this country perceived alcoholism and drug dependence. Marty Mann on the left spent almost her entire life basically trying to rewire this country's attitudes, and she did that very successfully and brought that advocacy movement into the early 1970s. And with Harold Hughes on the right, pioneered legislation that will create NIAAA and NIDA and begin this federal, state, local partnership that has really been the foundation of modern addiction treatment for these decades. So in the subsequent years since, which I'm condensing into a couple of sentences, we went from less than 500 programs in the 1960s when I first began to have contact with this field, to more than what is today, a report that I just read this week, we are now at more than 15,000 specialty sector addiction treatment programs. And let me just say euphemistically, this has been an amazing run for us. If somebody would have told me in those stench-filled backwards of Peoria State Hospital, Bill, don't despair because in your lifetime, you will see prominent people from all walks of life step forward and announce their status of being in recovery from alcoholism and drug dependence. They would have said, don't worry, you're going to see 15,000 addiction treatment programs in the United States before you die. You're going to see early intervention programs in the workplace and in the schools. You're going to see primary prevention programs throughout the country. Bill, you're going to see more than 100,000 people in recovery marching in the streets of the United States as people in recovery, publicly. I would have thought they'd been smoking the funny weed, because that would have been beyond my comprehension. And yet we have lived this incredible miracle of the past decades. We, at the same time, have reached a point in the evolution of our movement, which sets the stage for my next part of my presentation, that recovery advocates today are beginning to say, somewhere in the industrialization and commercialization of addiction treatment, something very precious got lost. In the movement of addiction treatment to an ever more acute model of intervention, I'm expecting drive-by treatment at any moment. It is getting so brief. And what the advocates are telling us is this. Somewhere along the line, this thing we call treatment became disconnected from the larger and more enduring process of addiction recovery. And what we're having advocates right now, whose earlier generations spent their lives building the foundation for us to meet in this room, that are saying it is time we fundamentally redesigned addiction treatment in the United States with a focus on long-term personal and family recovery. And I will reference that as we go forward. This brief history that I've reviewed with you raises interesting questions. Given these centuries and now decades of modern development, what can we say we know, not about addiction, not about the psychopathology of addiction or the neurobiology of addiction, but what do we know about this thing called recovery? And what do we know about it from the standpoint of science and history and decades of accumulated clinical experience? And I want to highlight some of the work that Dr. Kurtz and I have done trying to pull some of these questions together with answers. To do that is forcing us to begin with by far the most difficult task, and that is what's recovery? And defining that in ways that we can measure and we can track that over time. There are multiple efforts here and around the globe right now as we are shifting from a traditional pathology and treatment paradigm to a growing emergence of a recovery paradigm as our organizing center for the field. There's increasingly concern around how we define this concept. Many efforts. In general, what we're seeing is a cluster around three definitional components. The first of those, if you look at the Betty Ford Institute definition, is sobriety. Others will identify this first component in terms of remission, meaning that when we survey people, we will identify people who once met DSM-4 criteria for abuse or dependence, but have not met that criteria in the past 12 months. Are you with me? We haven't referenced anything related to abstinence or sobriety. We're simply saying they once had the disorder, they no longer have the disorder. Other groups are saying remission is not enough. We have to begin to talk in terms of abstinence or sobriety. That debate is continuing. But what's important for us in this room is that there are two additional components of this definition, which says that recovery is more than the elimination of alcohol and drugs from an otherwise unchanged life. And it says we must see two other things. And that is, because addiction is so devastating to so many dimensions of one's intrapersonal and interpersonal life, we must begin to see progress towards global health. And by global, we're talking about psychological and emotional and relational and occupational and spiritual. We're also beginning to talk about there's probably few disorders that are more socially alienating than is long-term addiction. So we're talking about recovery also involves a way of finding a pathway for reintegration to building a life in the community and outside of the world of subterranean drug cultures. So with that definition in place, on a parallel track has been the question, well, what do we know? We measure in incredible detail the slightest shifts in marijuana usage and marijuana attitudes and attitudes towards methamphetamine and this and that and the other. And we spent millions and millions of dollars creating the research industry to track this trend. So let me ask a couple very quick questions. Are there more people in recovery in the city of Boston today than there were last year? Of the people who are in recovery within the city of Boston, are there different recovery rates for men and women? Are the recovery rates different by age? Are they different by ethnic subcultures? Are they different for people with co-occurring psychiatric disorders compared to those without those disorders? And you know what? Historically, we could fill libraries with what we know about addiction, but we can't answer some of the most basic questions related to recovery. As a person in long-term recovery, the biologists at NIDA have continued to tell me that my brain was hijacked, but they never told me when I was going to get it back. Are you with me? They've told me about the neuropathology of addiction, but they haven't laid out the neurobiology of long-term addiction recovery. They tell me my children are at higher risk for addiction because of my family history. They can't tell me if my recovery status has anything to do with their vulnerability, increasing or decreasing or no effect. They can't tell me as a parent, is there anything I can do as a parent to alter their vulnerability? Or anything I can do if they should develop a disorder that would shorten their addiction career and lengthen their recovery career. They can't tell me what are the long-term temporal benchmarks of long-term recovery. They can't tell me what's the impact in the cycle of recovery for the family. They can't tell me as people age in recovery, and some of those individuals relapse after 20 and 30 years of recovery, what are the issues related to relapse after prolonged and stable recovery? Because that kind of a research agenda simply hasn't been on the drawing board. We could barely fill a shelf in our addiction studies libraries with what we know about the recovery experience, but we can fill whole buildings about what we know about the pathology of addiction. As we look at the issue of recovery prevalence, I've just finished a monograph looking at about 415 community and clinical studies. And one of the things that we're beginning to try to say is, look, we have millions of people in long-term recovery in the United States. It's time we began to study the solution to this problem as opposed to study the problem and extract lessons out of that lived solution. Well, when people say, what do you mean there are millions of people? Says who? Well, we've looked at every major epidemiological survey that studied remission from alcohol or drug dependence. The estimates right now in the current population in the United States, extrapolated from those studies, the best science we have, range in estimates between 25 and 40 million people in the United States in recovery from alcohol and drug dependence. If we look at issues related to rates of recovery, and we're talking two groups, rates of recovery in non-clinical community samples, and then rates of recovery within treatment samples. And you're going to see in the numbers below here, we're basically at rates of about 50% in community samples, about 47, a little over 47% for clinical samples. And if you look at the studies published since 2000, we're actually over 50% recovery rate, which I would suggest in and of itself should challenge the public perception and growing pessimism around recovery, because addiction is incredibly visible in this culture. Every day we have celebrities heading off to rehab after their latest crash and burn. But the second they stabilize and get in recovery, that story is not told in this country. Dr. Kurtz and I said, well, when we talk about degrees of recovery, is all recovery, or is there something different? And we find some fascinating differences here around the concept of recovery in the field of psychiatry, particularly with severe mental illness and within our addiction field. Historically, the mental health field has had a very well-defined definition of partial recovery, but literally no definition until very recently of full recovery from severe mental illness. We now have long-term studies of the course and trajectory of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, for example, that are really challenging that and really beginning to signal the emergence of the concept of full recovery from some of the most severe complex psychiatric disorders. On the addiction side, in contrast, we've had a very well-defined, a reified, if you will, concept of full recovery and no concept of partial recovery. In fact, it's almost heresy to even begin to talk about a legitimized concept of partial recovery within the addictions field. There's a third concept within this framework that Ernie Kurtz and I ran into, and that was we began to find scientific evidence and lots of anecdotal reports from therapists about people who got better than well. And what I mean by better than well, these are not people that we simply extracted the pathology out of their lives. But these are people who not only went on to recover, but they went on to live incredibly rich lives in terms of the quality of their life and the service to their communities. And these are people who would later begin to talk about addiction and recovery was for them a blessing. Now, I know some of you in this room have heard people with cancer say, cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me, and we're generally looking at them like they were lunatics, right? Well, that's the kind of thing, the way that people, and this is an idea that says, these are individuals that what they achieved following recovery was not in spite of their recovery, but from the kind of strength they drew out of their addiction and recovery experience that created a quality of life and a richness and a fulfillment of life maybe greater than they would have had if they would have never encountered this incredible crisis within their life that forever split their life into the categories of before and after. We have different recovery initiation frameworks. We're beginning to chart the secular and spiritual and explicitly religious pathways of long-term recovery. And as many of you know, we now have highly organized recovery mutual aid societies that parallel each of these kind of frameworks. What we do find here, and Dr. Kurtz and I are very interested in this, one of the fundamental big categories that we have, and one of the things that distinguished particularly 12-step recovery beginning in the 1930s, was earlier and subsequent secular frameworks of recovery were really about the assertion of self. They're really about someone reaching inside themselves and mobilizing strength and forging this commitment and making this big decision. And in 1840, signing the pledge that they would never drink alcoholic spirits again in their life. In contrast, we see a very different style of recovery in which the self is defined as the problem. And the issue is not how do we get into the self, the issue is how do we get out of the self in terms of transcendence of the self through a relationship with resources beyond the self. We're also seeing very differences in context, as you can see. We have a long history of solo recovery in the United States, of individuals who initiate and sustain recovery outside the framework of mutual aid or professional treatment. We have peer-assisted, treatment-assisted, medication-assisted are some of the categories we're starting to write about. If we look at styles of how do people start recovery, we've all worshipped stages of change theory for most of the last decade and gone through multiple cycles of motivational interviewing training, so we must make a nod to the idea that yes, recovery is a developmental process, and it's time-dependent for some people, but not for all. Because Bill Miller, who pioneered so much of the work around stages in change and motivational interviewing, and myself and others have been very fascinated by the study of transformational change or quantum change. This is change that is unplanned and positive and permanent, and it's like a lightning strike. That in one moment of time, the trajectory of one's life is forever changed. And we see within the large sampling of people in recovery within the community, we find these reports of transformational change experiences. We also find them within the recovery fellowships. And of course, we have these different styles of change. This sudden hot flash of Bill Wilson in 1934 in Charlestown's hospital, right? And then we have the other co-founder with this slow process of spiritual awakening, sort of setting forth the two prototypes of recovery initiation within the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. So what we know is we have both transformational styles and we have incremental styles. If we look at people's identities in recovery, we're kind of struck. We find some differences. In community populations, if we ask people the question, are you a person in recovery from alcohol or drug addiction? Or did you once have the disease of addiction, but now you're in recovery from that disorder? We'll get a certain percentage of people who will say yes to that question. If we ask the question, did you once have a significant problem in your relationship with alcohol or drugs that you no longer have today? What do you think happens to the self-reported numbers? In the second group, the numbers jump. And if we actually look at which of those individuals met DSM-4 criteria for a substance use disorder, there are a lot of people who met DSM-4 criteria for a substance use disorder who do not self-identify as a person in recovery, including many of you in this room who probably were diagnostically appropriate during your college years. So what I mean by that is technically someone is in recovery, diagnostically, but there's someone who does not acknowledge themselves or have not incorporated that into their identity. We have people with extremely positive pro-recovery identities. These are people, if you bump into them at the grocery store as strangers, they tell you their recovery story in the aisle. They are not only in recovery, they're ready to let the world know they're in recovery. This was particularly notorious in my early days of coming out of ex-addict-directed therapeutic communities. We created a generation of super ex-dope fiend folk heroes. And we were basically paid to run around the country spieling the story of how we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and all that kind of nonsense. I think it's also important to note there's another category here, and that's people who are in recovery but are deeply ashamed of that status because of the incredible social stigma that continues related to that. And I'm going to be very blunt. There are a number of those individuals who may hide behind vague rhetoric about anonymity as a spiritual tradition. But the bottom line is they're ashamed. Given their level of functioning, given their status within the culture, it would be extremely difficult for them to acknowledge. I'm not talking about acknowledging affiliation with a 12-step program. I'm talking about acknowledging themselves as a person in recovery. I want to tell you how pervasive. I'm one of the most out people, probably, in this country. And I can run around with my big Recovery March t-shirt, right? And I get home from a march, and my dear wife Rita says, "Can you run to the store for me?" And I say, "Sure." And without thinking, now this is decades now, I pulled my recovery t-shirt off and threw a sloppy old plain t-shirt on. And I'm about to walk out the door, and all of a sudden it hits me. I won't say the word, did I just do? And all of a sudden it realizes this stuff is insidious. You know, that it just keeps creeping back in. That I'm okay as a person in recovery when I'm surrounded by 15,000 people in recovery. But I'm a bit embarrassed to walk down the aisles of my local grocery store with a recovery celebration t-shirt on. That's how insidious some of this stuff gets to be. Obviously, there are changes in these statuses over time as people get into recovery. Styles of recovery, interpersonal styles. We have acultural styles, meaning individuals who initiate and sustain recovery without relationships with other people in recovery. Acultural. They do not relate to the culture of recovery in the United States. We have people who have a bicultural style, meaning they can operate within distinct communities of recovery and master the language and the etiquette and all the nuances of those fellowships. But they can also spend a lot of time and function quite comfortably with people that in the recovery community are called earth people or civilians or normies. They're bicultural. They're very fluid in terms of their ability to move back and forth. And of course, we have some people who are deeply enmeshed in the culture of recovery. In fact, live inside the culture of recovery so exclusively that they almost have no contact with the mainstream culture. This is particularly true of people who come out of deeply enmeshed styles of addiction and deeply enmeshed in particularly illicit drug cultures. Now, we also obviously have changes in these styles over time. Culturally enmeshed styles are not unusual for people in early recovery. It's part of a safety net and a sanctuary, if you will. But in some circumstances, this individual is going to go to a sponsor or whatever the mentor in a different recovery fellowship would be and make a suggestion that maybe they need to attend even more meetings. And you're going to have a sage person in recovery say, "You know what? I actually think you need to attend less meetings. In fact, I've got a new recovery program for you, and it's called Get a Life Program. And it's about time you stopped hiding within these rooms and began to go out and build a life of recovery in the larger community." My point with this is that we're beginning to see tremendous heterogeneity, incredible diversity around styles and frameworks of long-term recovery across these secular, spiritual, and religious frameworks. One of the questions we wrestled with, Dr. Kurtz and I, was, when does recovery become durable? When does sobriety today predict sobriety for a lifetime? When does my risk of resuming alcohol and drug use and having a reoccurrence of a substance use disorder plummet? And in fact, the benchmark we used was a benchmark that's been used for other medical disorders, which was how long do you have to be in stable recovery before your lifetime risk of ever experiencing a reoccurrence drops below 15%? And what we found with that is for alcohol dependence, study after study after study consistently came in between 4 and 5 years. With opiate dependence, it's actually a bit longer. We know that with opiate dependence, people who make 5 years in stable recovery from opioid dependence, 20 to 25% of them will still experience a recurrence of opiate dependence later in their lifetime. But let's think about that for a minute in terms of its implications. If 5 years is the benchmark, which is interesting because it's the same benchmark for a number of other disorders that some of you have experienced in this room. If we're treated for most cancers in the United States, what do they tell us about 5 years? It's the same data, right? So what they do in that 5 years with us is what? Think of the assertiveness, aggressiveness with which We do post-treatment monitoring and early reintervention with people with cancer. And in contrast, what we do with this acute care model of addiction treatment is we hold graduation ceremonies, for God's sakes, and hand people chips and hug them and tell them to have a great life and sever the service relationship. In spite of the fact we continue to use rhetoric that addiction is a chronic disorder, if we actually believe that, according to the scientific data, every addiction treatment program in the country dealing with people with high problem severity and complexity, at a minimum, would be following people routinely for 5 years. Even the most highly stabilized patients, at a minimum, would be getting at least an annual recovery checkup for 5 years. And I want to shift now to begin to talk about the experience of recovery and styles of recovery to what I'm starting to call the ecology of recovery. And that's this incredible historical shift that is underway. So far, everything we've done with addiction has been primarily focused on intrapersonal dynamics, to a little bit interpersonal dynamics, particularly related to the family. And I probably should make a very quick footnote on family related to this, because we did try to look at the whole issue of family recovery as part of this research review that we did. The historical practice in addiction treatment, if we tend to families at all, is to bring them in for these highly developed family programs. Agree? Family nights, family days, family weeks. I've had a lot of experience with family weeks. We bring the families in on Monday. Monday and Tuesday we sequester them and indoctrinate them with concepts related to disease and progression, et cetera, and we give them the neurobiology slides. We try to medicalize and demoralize. And then by Wednesday, we bring the partners back into the mix, and we go through an awful lot of yelling and screaming and crying. And then somehow by Friday, this whole thing comes together, and the families are hugging each other. They have incredible optimism for the future and a fantasy that when they walk out, they're going to live happily ever after. And that's kind of the illusion or delusion of Family Week in the United States. And unfortunately, we have research that suggests that recovery is horribly destabilizing for families. That families that have absorbed every insult addiction has to offer are at very high risk of disintegrating in the early stages of recovery if we don't build incredible support scaffolding for them. How many of you have seen people, families that served all those insults only to then get into recovery? What do you think the divorce rate is within the fellowships of people in their first 24 to 36 months of recovery? And we do nothing for those families. We do nothing to prepare them. We do nothing to support them. Stephanie Brown refers to this as the trauma of recovery, for God's sakes. What incredible language. And we have not yet come to really deeply understand what that means and what our role is in guiding families. Historical supports. Historically, we have 4 broad supports. We have natural support for recovery, meaning I mobilize resources inside myself, I initiate and I sustain recovery. And I do that in many cases with the support of my family or extended social network in some cases. Limited generalist support, meaning that I may also reach out for the support of my primary care physician or my pastoral counselor or my rabbi, or on and on and on. Natural, non-specialized supports. I may end up in marriage counseling and get some guidance related to my drinking and some cues related to that help me begin to rein in and make a decision around my alcohol and drug use. But primarily, we've had 2 major sources of specialized support. Peer recovery support within the organized recovery fellowships. And secondly, this thing we have called specialty sector addiction treatment. So if you look at these categories, we've got mutual aid on one side over here on the left, and we've got specialty sector treatment on the left, with a bit of a strained relationship between these 2 primary institutions over a couple hundred years. But essentially, they're it in terms of specialty support. Now, if you look in the middle, historically, we've had a vacuum because these two ends of this have been a kind of sanctuary, if you will, safe places for people to recover. And yet the middle of this, we find histories of maltreatment, histories of contempt, histories of discrimination. So the center is a history, almost a history of what isn't there more than what is there. So let's look a little bit about what's changing on the two sides. On the mutual aid side, we've seen this explosive growth of recovery mutual aid programs, not only in the United States, but around the world. Secondly, as we're seeing the philosophical diversification of recovery mutual aid beyond anything we could have envisioned. Even though, paradoxically, co-attendance is common. Not unusual for people in Women for Sobriety to also attend women's groups in AA. Believe it or not unusual for people in Secular Organization for Sobriety or Life Ring Secular Recovery to also attend AA meetings, particularly Quad A, Atheists and Agnostics in Alcoholics Anonymous. So in spite of these sort of silos, we're getting sort of interesting combinations there. For close to 200 years, one's identity over on this left side was primarily linked to one's recovery mutual aid society. So the identity was the identity of an AA member or an NA member or a Women for Sobriety member or Smart Recovery member. What's changing over on the left that I'm going to talk a little bit about is we're now beginning to see the emergence of a larger culture of recovery in which people are stepping beyond their fellowship identities and beginning to define themselves in common as people in long-term recovery. On the right side, we are beginning to see recovery as a new organizing concept within addiction treatment. We're beginning to see pushes towards this concept of long-term recovery management. People are beginning to challenge about wrapping recovery management within recovery-oriented systems of care. We're getting new roles like the recovery coaches, etc. So lots of things going on over here on the parallel. What's amazing, though, is what's going on in the middle. We got basically a new recovery advocacy movement. We're beginning to see new recovery support institutions and a culture of recovery emerging beyond anything that has historically existed in the United States. We're beginning to see these kind of advocacy posters. We're beginning to see recovery is everywhere campaigns launched not by addiction treatment programs, but by local grassroots recovery community organizations. We are beginning to see the mobilization of people in recovery. In 2001, recovery advocates came together in St. Paul, Minnesota, and launched what has become known as the New Recovery Advocacy Movement. We are now seeing an explosive rebirth of grassroots recovery community organizations that are not mutual aid societies and they are not addiction treatment programs. Historically, we didn't even have a category to talk about them. In these new recovery support organizations, we're seeing recovery community organizations. We're seeing the development of recovery community centers whose primary purpose is offering non-clinical recovery support services for individuals and families in long-term recovery. We're beginning to see a growing recovery home movement in the United States. And by the way, the RCOs that are spreading in this country includes the Massachusetts Organization for Addiction Recovery, MORE, who was one of the early leaders in this movement. We're getting the spread of a recovery home movement that is almost beyond comprehension and off the books. These are unfunded for the most part. These are individuals in recovery coming together, recognizing it's not enough to have a commitment to recovery. They got to have a world they can recover in. And they're beginning to build the physical space where that recovery can occur by joining together with other recovery people living in these houses with very simple democratic self-governance that says, don't pick up and pay the rent. We're seeing a recovery school movement in the United States, including the Boston Recovery High School that I had the privilege of coming in early yesterday and visiting. We're seeing collegiate recovery programs. I go to a large campus and I walk into an open recovery support meeting on the campus and I'm stunned to see 200 students in the room. I know they only got 30, 35 students in their so-called campus recovery program. And I say, who on earth are all these people? And here's what they told me specifically, one school. We're averaging between 1 and 2 individuals per week from the campus at large entering recovery because of the contact with our recovering students on campus. This is in an abstinence hostile environment, agreed? Which is how I would characterize most colleges and universities in the United States. So this recovery school movement is flourishing. We're getting recovery industries. We're people in recovery who begin to hire. We're getting companies that have figured out recovering people got a lot of lost ground to make up for, and some make very, very good employees. They will work their tail off. And so we've got companies that literally exclusively hire people in recovery. We're getting recovery community centers build in vocational training and job coaching. We're getting recovery ministries. Let me give you an extent of this growth. Churches in the United States, including in this city, whose doors were not open to addicted people in the 1980s or people with HIV and AIDS. Agreed? At the height of the cocaine epidemic and all of the craziness and insanity that went with that at a public policy level. Those same churches today have very aggressive recovery ministries. Celebrate Recovery is worth a mention in this context. Founded in the early 1990s, now exists as a faith-based framework of recovery in more than 10,000 churches in the United States. And you know what? In the treatment field, it's almost off our radar. Almost off our radar. And my point is, our world has been the world of treatment and the world of mutual aid, and there's a whole nother world emerging that we must become students of. We're beginning to see recovery cafes, recovery sports kind of activity. We're seeing an elaborate culture of recovery, of issues of history with its own values and language and symbols and literature. We're beginning to see, if I could summarize the trends and go to implications, 4 things. Tremendous growth in the varieties of addiction recovery experience. And as more and more people tell their stories, we're beginning to map out the immensity of that diversity. Number 2 is we're getting new, historically unprecedented recovery support institutions and new recovery support roles like recovery coaches and recovery support specialists. We're beginning to get an increasing focus on how do we build the physical space where people can recover in, as opposed to recycling an adolescent through 10 inpatient episodes of treatment. Maybe it's time we got out of our offices and went into the world that adolescent lives in and began to advocate for young people's meetings in that community and recovery support groups in the schools and student assistance programs in the schools and a recovery coach that can follow that child from a treatment institution into that community and help them build a life in the community as a person in recovery. And we're seeing a growing interest in the concept of community recovery. The idea that some communities have been so wounded by addiction and related problems that the community itself needs a recovery process. So we're beginning to talk about moving from our focus on the individual and maybe a little shimmer of shadow of the family to begin to talk about it's time we began to heal whole communities that have been wounded and create the space in those communities where people can not only recover but begin to break intergenerational cycles of alcohol and drug dependence. What are the implications? Number 1, we have no teachers on this issue. I am not a teacher. I am a student, and I'm challenging all of you to become students of this rapidly changing ecology of recovery in the United States. We need to understand the indigenous recovery capital within each of our communities that is far beyond the recovery fellowships that exist, and begin to figure out how do we begin to integrate those into treatment. We need to extend the service design of addiction treatment from an emergency room model to a model of sustained recovery management, and that process is very much underway in the United States. Number 3 is we need to move beyond the issue of reduction of pathology and begin to talk about this concept of recovery capital. How do we begin to build recovery capital, meaning the internal and external resources that people can mobilize to initiate and sustain long-term recovery? And talk about family recovery capital and neighborhood recovery capital and community recovery capital. That means we will be blending models of clinical intervention and therapy with models of cultural revitalization and community development. So we're going to begin to reintegrate peoples whose jobs are to organize recovery support services within our local communities. Number 5, and that is we're going to begin to look for potent combinations and sequences of clinical and non-clinical recovery support services that dramatically elevate long-term recovery outcomes, greater than if people only had one element of those. What we're looking for is the equivalent of, we're looking for the AIDS, the psychosocial equivalent of the AIDS cocktail. Do you understand? Where individual elements were found to have very limited power. But when we combine and sequence those, we get dramatically elevated power and potency of those interventions in terms of recovery outcomes. Finally, and I think this one is going to be very difficult for us, and that is the issue of how do we move from people going through our programs, quote, unquote, to how do we begin to develop an ever-expanding menu of ideas and metaphors and stories and interventions and support services that can be uniquely combined and sequenced to deal with the incredible diversity of the people that we have entering our programs. In closing, I want to say one thing. My entire presentation reflects, I hope, a sense that we are on the brink of moving from a pathology paradigm and a treatment paradigm as the center of the field to a paradigm of recovery. What some of you don't know in this room is that some of you will go on in the city of Boston, in the state of Massachusetts, and nationally to help lead this movement. And for those of you in this room, I wish each of you, and particularly those of you who may not know it, but your destiny is tied up with this larger movement that is now unfolding. I wish all of you Godspeed on your journey into this recovery frontier. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You got that many standing ovation.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that. Thank you.